Beautiful. Fantastic. So we are all here today to do a bit of a Q&A. We have all four of us, which have just completed our honors year in multiple different disciplines. So to start off, I just want to acknowledge that we are all on Ngunnawal, and Ngambri land, and we all pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So just to do a brief introduction of myself, my name is Maddie Hepner. I use pronouns she, her. I have just finished up my honors in photography and media arts, and my project specifically looked into the American alt-right in relation to the concept of the American dream and circulated imagery within an alt-right internet sphere. So we'll go around the virtual room and just kind of introduce ourselves and our practice a bit more. So Sarah, if you wanted to just kick off.
Yeah, so my name is Sarah Murray. My pronouns are she, her. I just finished up my honours in painting, and my project looked at the bodily experience of landscape, so looking at the visceral presence of being in the landscape and that relationship to painting.
Cool. My name is Matt Freeman, and I'm studying in jewelry and object, and my pronouns are he, him. My project was around the concept of bringing violence onto the body as an empowering force and reframing that as like a process that can be utilized for rebellion.
Hi, I'm Natasha Pidcock. My pronouns are she/her, and I have just completed my honours year in the painting workshop, and my project looked at image proliferation in virtual and physical spaces we live in, and my project looked at how painting could potentially slow down the speed which images are consumed.
Fantastic. So I think we'll just kick straight into it. We were joking previously about how we have to have a one only lockdown question just to kind of prime up everyone for a nice conversation and just to get it out of the way. So we'll go around and just kind of talk about the one lockdown question, which is, was your lockdown helpful or hurtful in relation to your artistic practice and also your honors work? So we'll start off with Sarah.
Yeah, look, lockdown was probably not the best thing for my practice this year. Last year I was in lockdown too, finishing my third year work, and that really shaped the work that I made, because I then, instead of working in the studio, I took my work out on plein air and was working there. So that really, changed the direction and what this honours year was going to be. And so I started off doing that at the start of the year when we weren't in lockdown, but then progressed back into the studio space, but then we didn't have the studio space. So yes, it was a bit difficult.
Well, I would say that just generally lockdown was kind of a harmful experience to the honors flow of things, because keeping up momentum was really difficult, but I think it really changed the stance of where I was looking at. It was a lot less looking inwards towards how I approached making work, and a lot more looking outwards to the socio-political spheres and how they were changing during that time, because there were a lot of things of interest to my topic, like the riots that were around and whatnot. So I think that was interesting, that there was a larger focus looking to the world rather than looking towards my practice. So potentially beneficial.
Yeah, I know what you mean, Matt. I think I feel the same way in that regard as well, because a lot of the work that I was doing was very much computer based, and I think is still very much internet based. So it was a bit of an interesting time, understandably so, also because I was looking at the US rather than looking here. in Australia. But it was, yeah, it just kind of changed my mindset almost a bit more in that sense, because I was able to really give myself to my computer, which sounds a bit scary, but it was true in that sense, where it was like I was really able to absorb all of this content even more because I didn't have as many distractions or normal day errands that I would do. So it was a bit of a, I don't like, in the context of things, I think it's similar to you, Matt, in the sense where it's like, it was good and bad. But yeah, it's just different. I think that's really kind of the basis with everyone's work, is that it had differences to it. So
yeah, lockdown certainly was not a creative residency for me. I did struggle with it a bit, but I found it really interesting because my project for honours was inspired by like me wanting to reflect on how the virtual space was heightened, and all of my experiences I found in 2020 were characterized by some virtual aspects. So I really wanted to reflect on that this year. And looking, and then lockdown happened and I just had to laugh. I thought it was over.
Yeah, I think it was definitely, obviously a big change for all of us to be in the studio for such a short-ish period of time, and then having to come out of the studio in August and readjust to making it home. But yeah, in many ways, I think it's interesting as well to reflect on one's own project, thinking about if there would be any differences if we were still in the studio at some stage. But that's kind of obviously a whole other wormhole that anyone can go down into. But yeah. So then almost thinking about, obviously we had to go through all of these different precautions when it came to going back into the studio during lockdown, and then also how that reflected in our work, being back and forth a bit when it came to making. So my general question, I think, for everyone is, was there anything that you really needed to be cautious about when it came to making your work or understanding the concepts behind your work, almost in a bit of a parallel line with being cautious about obviously like pathological agents that we're kind of having to dodge and weave?
I think that within my body of work, like the pandemic kind of framed a lot of issues around what I wanted to be achieving, because a lot of my work, especially within the jewelry realm, is about being interacted with and being touched. So that from the get-go was kind of a struggle throughout the year to try and figure out other ways of how we can interact and touch without necessarily touching, and how we can sense the body in objects without necessarily actually like physically interacting with them. But also from that, a lot of the topics around what I was looking towards through violence and jewelry were very loaded. So there was a lot of, I guess, a lot of care that had to go into how that was addressed and how that was looked at. And a lot of the semesters were spent trying to find, I guess, like reasons or excuses or just avenues that can explain like what I was committing to. But yeah, I think that like caution kind of like outlined the whole honors year. There was a lot of things that I wanted to approach that were potentially quite corrosive. So yeah, definitely caution's undertone.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you have any kind of specific examples of a work that you were focusing on that had a specific concept to it that you were a bit unsure about, or anything kind of more material based? Or
so a lot of what I was looking towards was like using iconographies of guns, because like the gun philosophy, which is something I find really interesting, like talks to a gun as being a force multiplier of the user's will, and I think that's a really interesting concept. You can have an object that allows you to do what you want or get what you want, but I think that then those philosophies fall really short when they go, oh, like a gun is amoral. The design, it does not commit to anything that is classified as dangerous or harmful. And a lot of what I've been looking into is about adversarial design, which is this approach which talks to like the inherent politics to the objects that we make. And I think a gun is like one of the most inherently like political things around. So like trying to present or play with those in the like in the perspective that I was looking towards about this being a potentially useful or good thing was really kind of tentative and scary to do, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting as well, because obviously all of us have some kind of idea of what a gun is and what it does, but then when you think about its power that it has behind it just in the object itself and not necessarily how it's used, but then also bringing in the ideas of how it is used and how its power is kind of used in a negative sense as well is really interesting. Did anyone else feel kind of cautious when making their work or kind of figuring out their own concepts for the honors year?
Yeah, so my project, I use collage, like collage found imagery to make my paintings. And so my paintings come from found media. And one of the issues with like I found myself being cautious about in the project was how I approach like reproducibility, and how because a lot of the criticism artists do get when they use found imagery is, I guess, copying, and it's a bit of criticism. So I was very cautious with how I approach, like, you know, taking this found media and then painting it, because yeah, I did find that the pandemic sort of made it hard to be. I was very cautious about the future, so I found that my work was very much about being in the present space, and I found, yeah, so I guess there's a bit of caution in relation to the future, and then I was cautious about employing reproducibility because I was really worried about, I guess, meeting criticism with taking images that weren't mine, and I wanted to find ways to, yeah, to sort of make my painting my own work rather than being someone else's.
Yeah, I think our projects link really well in that regard, Tash, just because obviously both of us were really focusing in on circulated imagery of the 21st century, but then also thinking about, you know, the barrage of the mass of images that we ingest on a daily basis, and then taking that out of the context of the screen and really starting to critique it and pull it apart. So I did this huge kind of video work that spans for about 5 minutes that is compiled of probably like 1,500 images now, and it's a really big ongoing project that I'm doing, but takes out all of these really politically loaded images and puts them in the same space. And it's just kind of this overwhelming sense of repetition and just kind of putrid content that's coming out of these communities, and really trying to strip them down and understand what they're doing and the power that they have. So I think that it's a really interesting dynamic of trying to be cautious in your work and understanding the concepts behind it, but also trying to critique it as well and putting your own message within the work as well. Did you feel that way as well, Sarah, with any of your work that you made this year?
Yeah, I feel like what you're saying about the caution versus critique speaks well to what my project was aiming to do, because like Matt, my my topic was like a loaded topic, like the the tradition of landscape painting has been like categorized by like a colonial and patriarchal paradigm that I didn't want to contribute to, and I wanted to critique that that idea of creating a distance from the body in the space of landscape and like the colonial idea of putting power over landscape, like claiming ownership to the land and painting in that way. So my caution was that I didn't want to contribute to that that history, and instead I wanted to critique that way of painting, and by still exploring the topic of a landscape. So in my work I wanted to create a human connection to the space of landscape, to present it as something that is not distant from us, that is not something that we have power over and can control, but instead presenting a symbiotic relationship between the human and the space of landscape. And presenting a space that isn't a singular perspective.
My question just for you, Sarah, kind of going off of what you just said about your relationship with power with your paintings, did you feel that either at the beginning, middle, or end of creating these works that you employed any sense of power, or did you gain any sense of power from making them or seeing them?
Yeah, I think there was an interesting relationship between power in my work, because my initial aim was to show a relinquishing of power over the painting, so that I'm not to establish a lack of control. So in my first work that I made called Untitled Diptych, I brought it out on to bushland and created indexes of the land and natural objects around that I didn't really have the agency over. I just like scattered it over the canvas to create that kind of connection between the land that I was referencing, and relinquish that sense of control. Making the actual site an active agent in the work, rather than me standing back and viewing the work and having power over it. But I think as I established my honours project, I also wanted to speak on what my work also explores abstract expressionism, which has been a very male-dominated sphere in the painting world. And I think that I established more power in the sense of inserting my own self into that male-dominated narrative and challenging these patriarchal norms that are in that sphere of painting. So by creating bodily indexes of my own self in the space of painting, like through gesture and mark making, to assert my own body in this space, which has been so male dominated.
I think that it's a really interesting common thread that we're like challenging a lot of preconceived notions through what we're doing. And it's really interesting that we like identified what we care about within our projects, and then saw the red flags and went, you know what, this isn't reason to stop. This is reason to like soldier forward and keep like digging into what we're looking at, and not be like afraid or defined by the things that we are worried about within our projects. And I think that that is a really distinct honours outcome for each of us.
Yeah, I agree with you in that sense too, Matt, because it's almost in a way it's like getting very comfortable with something that is uncomfortable. Now, we're not speaking for the whole of the honors cohort in regards to getting comfortable with a very uncomfortable topic. But as you said, it is very much a common thread between the four of us, which is really feeling out those boundaries and understanding where the work that you're making is sitting, and especially in context with other artists that are working in the same space and working with the same themes. So it is, yeah, it's interesting to think about, but also helpful in a sense too, because, you know, when it comes to making an honors work, if you can really hone in on what you want to do and understand that this year is really about fleshing out, you know, your entire project, but not necessarily having a super finite, solidified, tied up end point for it, and using it as a platform to really bounce off even more ideas once you finish. It's really fruitful in that sense. Does anyone else feel the same, or was that just me?
No, definitely. I think that that throughout the project, more questions came than answers, but all those questions are really interesting avenues for continued exploration. And I think it's exciting to have found like the taproot of my personal cares about like my interests and the things that I want to push within my work. And that kind of only really happened through the reading and writing and making through honors. So yeah.
Yeah. I think also just going back to your project too, Matt, in relation to obviously understanding and uncovering the topics and the ways of violence in today's society, but then also how jewelry can really impact that and come into that conversation as well. Do you have some more thoughts about that?
Well, I think that like the reason that I chose jewelry is because of jewelry's ability to participate in and out of like of scenarios in a way. Like I think that like the gallery is much like a boxing ring in a lot of ways, in that it is like this altered state where like you could see a dead body in a gallery and be like, oh, you know, this is probably something to do with an artwork, and you kind of like, yeah, it kind of defers judgment sometimes. And I think that jewelry has this interesting ability of being in that space and then being out of that space and then being pedestrian. And I think that that is like a really powerful thing for jewelry. And I think that what I was trying to do with like the with violence in that regard was to kind of empower individuals in a mode of resistance by being able to critique within the established like gallery spaces, and then keep that as they leave, and keep that like criticality on themselves and identify with that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was just thinking again almost about Tasha's work. Did you feel, Tash, that in any way you were straddling a bit of a fine art, lowbrow area? Just, I think also, you know, the combination of found images to the medium of painting, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so my project sort of started with the want to sort of figure out how painting can resist the attention economy and all the sort of forces behind the images, because painting is sort of exists in a privileged space where people do tend to pay attention to it a bit more. They sort of will spend time trying to figure out what the artist is saying, maybe a bit more so than just scrolling on a feed. So I sort of played with that sort of notion this year. And I found in doing so, by trying to sort of comprehend like the kaleidoscopic stream of media that I guess virtual and physical spaces can be characterized by, I found that those sort of meditations on that led actually to a way to sort of just sort of investigate the master narrative structures that are in art history, particularly the Western male-dominated tradition of painting. I found that by sort of, you know, going through found imagery, I was really interested in actual art history. And I was borrowing images from art history, and then I was able to paint them in a way where they sort of now exist in the forefront of pop culture again, but in a more inclusive sort of space. So I found, that was actually surprisingly empowering about my work. I didn't realize I was doing it until I looked back when I was writing my exegesis, and I was like, oh, like, yeah, I just found that honours project sort of really led into just sort of, yeah, dissecting so much more than what I ever thought I could do.
That makes me think of your work, Maddie, and the recontextualization of images. If you could like speak a bit more on that and bringing the, like, in the first semester when you brought these digital images into the physical space, and then progressing more into the when we were in lockdown, when they still were in that digital space in your video work.
Yeah, I kind of went through a really interesting trajectory over the course of this year, where initially I was looking really heavily into Google Street View and taking images through that way, and then had kind of this moment that I realized where I was still functioning in a 20th century photographic headspace, and that to really dissect the images that I was looking at, I needed to look into more of that 21st century headspace. So I think taking the images out of the context of the spaces that they were habitating in was a big kind of topic for me. But then also, I was dancing a bit of a fine line, and I think caution again was really a big thought in my mind when it came to working with the material that I did.
What kind of, when you're talking about caution in your work, what were like the potent like areas that you were really wary of, Maddie?
I think what I was really cautious about in my project specifically was more understanding the power that the images have and currently have today in like on social media and online, but then also wanting to showcase them for what they are, but not necessarily promoting that content. So I had to be very strategic in what I was doing to understand the content, but then also working with and against it in a sense too. So thinking about these ideas of representation and representing representation through digital media, and then also the power in all of the images that they hold and what they do when they're all together specifically as well. A really big idea that I was starting to get into towards the end of this year, and now especially, is how the digital machine itself reacts to the content that it's being fed on a daily basis. So I was creating these AI video internet performances where a generative engine would produce AI images from what was being put into the interface. And so again, it was giving the computer itself agency about what it was ingesting, but also handing over, in a way, my power of critique into the machine's hands, so it could then kind of relay that information back to me in a sense. So yeah, it was an interesting trajectory from the beginning of this year to the end, but it was a necessary one in that sense, because then I could really understand, the material that I was unpacking. Yeah.
I guess from there, I'm interested in like, I wonder like what drew you to that line of thinking. What was the allure of the alt-right and the imagery? Was it the kind of mimetic properties of it, or was it the was it comical? Was it scary? Like, how do you feel about these like things that you were digging into?
Yeah, I think all of the above. For me specifically, I started off this year focusing on the concept of the American dream in relation to the United States today. And so understanding this ideal of this concept and how it just doesn't necessarily add up in today's context of the US, and wanting to show that the disjointedness between those two, you know, idealized concept and not necessarily ideal country. So I almost kind of stumbled into the alt-right because I was thinking initially that I was just going to be able to take a photo of this disjointed American dream through some online form. But I didn't necessarily know until I started really investigating into the alt-right community that I really wanted to focus on that and showcase, you know, this immense passion, nationalism for a certain country, and the constant cycle of all of this information that these people put out into the internet and on social media. So I think that's what really drew me to the alt-right, was thinking about how the ways in which they use images and text to push these ideas and change political viewpoints, but then also seeing it as an interesting subculture and online community to focus on, as well as being somewhat scared about it, truly. A lot of my work that I do is very political, so this one is definitely no different, but in the sense of focusing more on the alt-right, it was wanting to understand and unpack the thinking behind that, all of that.
Yeah,
So,
cool.
Yeah.
I think that's like a fair point, that they're really emblematic of that disconnect. And I think that, like, yeah, it makes sense that that's like where you got like drawn into, because there is a lot of scary and kind of potent stuff being sprouted by them.
I think it was also just, I was very interested in, you know, this constant pop-up of all of these new social media platforms that they're creating, and what kind of content is actually being circulated on them that isn't necessarily regulated and is really approved and taken in by all of these community members. So that was kind of like I was like, oh, I'm just gonna dip my toe in and it'll be fine. Like, I won't focus on the alt-right. But then it took me as well. But yeah, it is really interesting.
Do you have any sort of, or feel any obligation to sort of narrate like your research in a way that was truthful or honest to what you were seeing? Yeah, it's pretty hectic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was also the kind of thing which was, with my work, I didn't necessarily want to put too much of my own personal opinion into it and really let the critique sit for itself. So I think when it comes to truthfulness in the work that I made, it was almost just, yeah, really trying to represent that online representation through that, and letting the images really, the constant scroll of the images and the collation of them speak for itself in that sense. But my curation of putting them together, bringing in that critique. So did you feel the same, Tash, when it came to trying to figure out, you know, the images that you wanted to use in your paintings?
Yeah, I sort of found that there is a point where I was sort of worried if I should depart from like what was actually being presented to me, and then me like having that, like, including that in my work. I was worried about, I guess, taking the images too far from what it actually meant, but I sort of found that you know, through painting these images, I was sort of able to find that, yeah, departing them from their original context, like that, you know, in the collage process become so, they get so far removed from their original context where it was sort of, it wasn't a worry anymore. It sort of didn't matter how reliable I was as a narrator to speaking to the original images. I was concerned about that at first, but throughout the project, it's kind of like actually taking them far away from their original context, cropping them. Yeah, it's a really interesting concern I found that was apparent in your project as well, just sort of being honest to what originally was there, but then sort of making your work speak for itself.
Yeah, yeah. It's having a hand in the critique of it, but also understanding the material that you're working with and being able to almost feed off of that a bit more. Did you feel the same, Matt, in relation to the concepts that you were focusing on? Did you have kind of any you know, specifics that you were critiquing or thinking about in relation to the work that you were making?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that a lot of the work that I was building was kind of looking towards critiquing power structures. So the premise was to divert the I guess the monopolization of forces of violence towards individuals in the hope that that would develop resistance and rebellion. So I think that that played a large part, but there was a lot of you know, wanting to put your like hands into this material but not letting it like fully digest what you're trying to do with it. You know, I think that a lot of these forces that I was really interested in are kind of runaway forces, you know, and you don't want to how I presented it really mattered, because you couldn't just elevate it to a status of like art object and then let it be and let it spin off, because that then allows it to be interpreted by or like what's the word? I guess like that like I couldn't just like allow my making my objects to just be given up as like a free emblem for other people to misinterpret and take. So there's a lot of focus on accurately and honestly portraying my concerns through what I was doing. Yeah.
I think that's interesting as well, just thinking about you know, with this year's grad show being online and then not being able to, actually I take that back. It's a bit of a funny line that we're walking, because I was thinking about it in the sense of showing work in a physical space and being there physically and having that physical in-gallery text to back up your work. But then also on the other hand, putting it online makes it harder to interpret the work because you are viewing it from a screen, but then you also have the ability to, you know, explain yourself a bit more in that sense, because you have an online platform where people are captivated to stay a bit longer, hopefully. Did anyone feel the same way, or feels the same way in that sense as well, where obviously there is that difference between physical space and online gallery, but just thinking about the ways that your work is being interpreted?
Yeah, I think in my work, I've been a bit worried about that interpretation in the physical space, because it just condenses like the image of the work to such a small like image that you can just view on your phone or on your screen. And a big aspect of my work is the material affect of the work itself, and that relationship between the viewer and the viewing experience. So yeah, for my work, I have deliberately tried to make the scale a main factor of the work, to make it an immersive experience. So when viewing the work in person, you can be like fully surrounded by this kind of ambiguous space, and then have that sort of bodily experience, similar to what I did in making the work, and viewing the work from multiple perspectives. So seeing this like shifting and pulsating view of landscape that isn't a singular perspective. So I think that online sort of presentation of my work kind of hinders it, because you only can see it from this singular perspective, and it doesn't have that sort of material engagement that is so present. What about you, Tash? Because I know that you've been focusing on the materiality of painting as well. How do you think that your work will respond to this digital space?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, because my project was started off being like, I'm so sick of like the virtual experience, and I started off being like, but it's over now, and it's not. So as much as I would have loved them to have existed in that white cube gallery space, I just think it's really interesting how I was trying to resist the attention economy and that sort of, oversaturation of images. And now being online, I've just fed straight back into that. And I think it's kind of, I don't know, poetic maybe.
Even if the work was in a physical space, there is still always now that digital presence of anything that you see. So it's idealistic in a sense to assume that your work is not going to get encompassed by that attention economy and put back into an online space. But it is obviously trying to understand that, but then also being able to not necessarily manipulate, but change people's views in the sense of seeing it for the first time. So you have that power in that sense to showcase the work to someone in a physical space for someone's first time, rather than it being on a virtual platform. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just, very naive to think my work would have a digital presence in 2021.
Yeah.
What are the premises through your work that you're being critical of? Because I know that's a really interesting common thread between all of our works, like Maddie being critical of the alt-right, but presenting that, without like a nuance of judgment in the way that you want to like share that with people, so that way they can bring their own criticality and their own understanding to those things. And Sarah being quite critical of the colonialist landscape perspective in painting. I think these are like it's interesting that that's like was a part of your focus. Would you say that's like a strong focus in your work, Sarah? Like is that like a driving force to why you have committed to what you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. I think I was originally just inspired by just the place of landscape in general, and I wanted to see how I can fit into that space, and found that in research of the like Western tradition of the landscape painting, that it has been like quite colonially dominated, and I wanted to critique that in my work, and kind of work into that space, but
I think it's strong to be a shaker and mover in what you're intending on doing. And I'm interested to hear, Tash, like what would you say that you were being like critical or critiquing within what you were working with?
Yeah, so I was looking at the structures behind the attention economy and seeing how, or if painting could resist like the attention economy by sort of slowing down the way we consume. And in doing so, I was looking at art historical images, and I sort of found that by looking at the attention economy, I was sort of looking at the dominating factors behind art history as well, like the Western male-dominated tradition and narratives, and all of a sudden just sort of critiquing that not accidentally. It was just sort of, it wasn't the driving factor behind my work at first, and it's definitely the direction I'm heading in now. But just sort of how one thing can lead to another, and I was so concerned with something else, and by doing so, actually opened up another door of critique and thinking about just unpacking what I was looking at. And where it sort of came from, and how it's just sort of offers a critique on multiple things.
Thinking about critique on one specific work that I made for this year, where I created a Twitter bot that would ingest alt-right content and then rearrange and make its own tweets every 3 hours. And I obviously really saw this as a form of contextual research and not necessarily an artistic investigation. So when I was thinking about how I wanted to critique the material that my bot was critiquing, I decided to print those tweets onto toilet paper and then have a video clip of myself kind of like pulling the roll out so you can read each of the tweets, and then it reverses back, so it goes back onto the roll and shows that kind of constant cycle of obviously the rate in which people tweet and ingest digital content nowadays, but then also kind of trying to poke some fun at Trump, the myth of Trump tweeting on the toilet. So I think definitely in that work itself, moving forward from the full scroll of images that I did and the AI content, that was probably the most critical, I think, in my opinion, of the content that I was ingesting, because of obviously the physical form that I was printing on. So yeah, I agree with Matt in the sense that critique is very much a common thread between all of our projects, and it's a really interesting one as well.
Yeah, I think that that just ties back to largely power structures, and also my understanding of revolution versus rebellion, and how one goes about taking down power structures, and that you can't utilize the tools of the same structure, because then you will just build the same structure up again with a different face on the top. And I think through my project, I was really interested in offering new findings and new tools for approaching a rather constant state of resistance, rather than a transient temporary push into just putting flipping a coin, making it tails rather than heads, because it's still the same thing, so I'd say God, I think my project is really loaded on all forms, through critiquing structures, critiquing objects, critiquing politics, critiquing philosophy. There's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack. In how big are your objects roughly, Matt?
Some of them will be room scale occupying, and kind of interacting with people, and others are body scale objects. So but through symbols and actions, I think that you can begin to kind of impress an understanding of these things, but that's only the beginning.
Yeah. And with that, just my final question for the room. Moving forward from this year, obviously understanding that all of us have had an interesting year, not only in making sake, but also in conceptual growth. My question is, are there areas of your project that you're finishing up on now that you are interested in pulling further? And no one can say no because you have to.
I would say definitely. I think there's multiple avenues of research that I'm really interested in. I think every one of the objects that I've made over the honours period has a really large potential as an avenue to travel down, and I'm hoping to carry on this research in some manner through a master's program and then hopefully a PhD if I can string it out that long. Yeah.
I have to find a lot of questions. I'm sure you'll be able to find them.
I have thousands of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, I did find that in doing honours this year, I've sort of only just scratched at the surface of what I find really interesting. And I think, you know, it's sort of just only the beginning of a massive exploration into, you know, image proliferation and all that. It's something I've found interesting and I'm only at the beginning of. It's just, yeah, barely answered.
Yeah. It's a slippery slope. I'll just tell you that. It's slippery. Yeah.
I feel like for my project, what has led me to more questions is just more material investigations. I feel like I've expanded the way that I have painted just from the start to where my works are now. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot more there to explore just in the material investigation of painting.
That is really interesting too. Yeah, thinking about material investigation and pushing that even further. So I think, yeah, I feel the same in the sense where, you know, similar to everyone in the concept being able to feed me for many years to come, and just finding even more niche, interesting strands off of that. But as I said before, really starting to get interested in the way in which the digital machine ingests the content that it's looking at and giving it almost a bit of a platform and a voice to speak on what it is encountering on a daily basis. So yeah, lots more exciting things to come. Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic. I've really appreciated it. It's been great to get more in depth with everyone's projects and understand them a bit more. So thank you.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.